The radar operator at the chain home station in Dover squinted at his screen, wiping sweat from his forehead. The blips were faint, almost ghostly, but they were there. He adjusted the gain, his fingers trembling slightly. "Sir," he called out to the station commander, "I'm getting multiple contacts. Range 120 miles, bearing 085. Altitude. Impossible to determine, but they're high. Very high." Station Commander Reginald Thwaites leaned over the young operator's shoulder, his neatly trimmed mustache twitching. "Calm down, son. Probably a flock of geese. Or our boys returning from a patrol." He patted the operator's shoulder. "The Germans don't have anything that can fly that high. Their bombers are sitting ducks below 20,000 feet. It's basic aerodynamics, lad. Their engines can't breathe up there." The operator, a fresh-faced youth of 19 named Peter, shook his head. "No, sir. The signal's too strong for birds. And the speed. They're moving at over 300 miles per hour. In formation." Thwaites chuckled, a dry, condescending sound. 300, at that altitude. "Son, the Luftwaffe's best fighter, the Messerschmitt 109, struggles to make 300 at 20,000 feet. You're telling me they've got bombers doing that at God knows what altitude? Your set needs recalibrating. The humidity today is playing havoc with the signals. Mark it as a probable anomaly and log it." He straightened up, adjusting his uniform jacket. "The Germans are beaten in the air. The Battle of Britain proved that. Their technology is inferior. They're relying on numbers, not innovation. Remember that." Peter watched the blips continue their steady, relentless progress across the cathode ray tube. They weren't deviating. They weren't scattering. They moved with a purposeful, terrifying precision. He knew, with a cold certainty that settled in his gut, that his commander was wrong. But he was a lowly radar operator, and Reginald Thwaites was a decorated veteran of the Great War. He logged the contacts as unidentified probable equipment malfunction. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something monstrous was gliding, unseen and unsuspected, through the thin, cold air high above the English Channel. Something that defied everything they thought they knew. What Thwaites dismissed as impossible aerodynamics was, at that very moment, being proven brutally possible by an engine technology so advanced it would have seemed like science fiction just 2 years earlier. This arrogance, this profound and systemic underestimation of German technological capabilities in the latter stages of World War II, was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of a carefully cultivated narrative of Allied industrial and technical superiority, a narrative that was about to be shattered. The roots of this miscalculation stretched back to the war's early years and were deeply embedded in the very intelligence apparatus designed to prevent such surprises. British and American intelligence agencies, particularly the Photo Reconnaissance Unit (PRU) and the Office of Strategic Services (OSS), had constructed a detailed and ultimately flawed portrait of German aircraft production. They focused on known quantities: the mass-produced Junkers Ju-88, the reliable but vulnerable Heinkel He-111, the formidable but short-ranged FW-190. Their assessments, based on intercepted communications, prisoner interrogations, and aerial photographs of factories like those at Wiener Neustadt and Regensburg, pointed to a German aviation industry straining under Allied bombing, churning out incremental improvements of existing designs, not revolutionary new ones. A key document, a Joint Intelligence Committee report from late 1943, confidently stated, "German aircraft design has reached a developmental plateau. Faced with critical shortages of strategic materials, particularly high-grade aviation fuel and specialized alloys, and under constant aerial bombardment, the enemy has been forced to prioritize quantity over quality. There is no evidence to suggest the Luftwaffe will be able to field a new generation of high-performance aircraft before the end of 1945, if then." This assessment was gospel. It informed tactical planning, bomber command targeting priorities, and the design specifications for the next generation of Allied fighters like the P-51 Mustang and the Hawker Tempest. The Allies believed they were in a race they had already won. They were looking backward, fighting the War of 1943, while German engineers, working in hidden, dispersed facilities, were designing the War of 1946. The prejudice was not merely analytical, it was cultural. There was a pervasive belief in Allied command circles, often unspoken but deeply felt, that German science, for all its flashes of brilliance, was fundamentally rigid, lacking the pragmatic, mass-production genius of American industry or the dogged, inventive spirit of British engineering. They saw German designs as over-engineered, complex, and difficult to produce in the vast numbers needed to win a war of attrition. A famous, though possibly apocryphal, quote attributed to the head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, General Henry Hap Arnold, captured this sentiment. The Germans can build a watch. We can build 10,000 clocks, and 10,000 clocks tell better time than one watch in a war. This analogy was repeated in briefing rooms from Washington to London. It was comforting, it was logical, and it was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The flaw in this logic was the assumption that the next leap would be incremental. They expected a slightly faster Messerschmitt, a slightly more maneuverable Focke-Wulf. They were not prepared for a paradigm shift. They were not prepared for an aircraft that rendered the very concept of altitude as sanctuary obsolete. What Allied intelligence had tragically missed, or willfully ignored in a handful of dismissed reports, was the quiet revolution taking place in the forests of Bavaria and the underground factories of the Harz Mountains. While Allied bombers pounded known industrial centers, a secret weapons program of staggering ambition was proceeding unscathed. The story of this surprise begins not with an aircraft, but with an engine. A revolutionary engine that would power not just a new plane, but a new kind of warfare. The brainchild of a brilliant, driven engineer named Dr. Anselm France, the Junkers Jumo 4 turbojet was a masterpiece of compromised genius. It was not the world's first jet engine. That honor went to the British Whittle engine. But it was the first to be translated into a reliable, mass-produced weapon of war. While the Allies were still tinkering with prototypes, the Germans were solving the immense practical problems of metallurgy, fuel combustion, and thrust management that had bedeviled jet propulsion. The challenges were Herculean. Early jet engines consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, had a terrifying tendency to flame out or explode, and required special nickel-chromium turbine blades that were in critically short supply. Dr. France and his team at Junkers Motorrenwerk, working under the direct patronage of Armaments Minister Albert Speer, overcame these obstacles with a combination of brilliant innovation and brutal pragmatism. Lacking sufficient high-temperature alloys, they developed a crude but effective hollow-blade cooling system, allowing them to use lower-grade steel. To combat the engine's sluggish acceleration, they devised a simple throttle management system that pilots had to learn meticulously. It was not a perfect engine. It had a service life of only 25–30 hours, a fraction of a conventional piston engine's. But it worked. And by early 1944, it was rolling off assembly lines in a converted salt mine near Magdeburg at a rate that would soon reach over 1,000 units per month. This number, 1,000 jet engines a month from a single hidden facility, was one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. It was a figure that would have been dismissed as pure fantasy by the Allied analysts who believed German production was collapsing. The airframe designed to harness this revolutionary power was equally radical. The Messerschmitt Me 262, nicknamed Schwalbe, Swallow, by its makers, was not merely a piston plane with jet engines bolted on. It was a creature of pure function, a sleek, shark-like form with swept wings, a design feature that delayed the onset of compressibility and buffeting at high subsonic speeds. Its performance figures, had they been known to the Allies, would have been laughed out of any intelligence briefing. a top speed of 540 miles per hour, nearly 120 mph faster than the superlative P-51D Mustang, a climb rate that could take it to 30,000 feet in less than 7 minutes, a feat that took a Mustang over twice as long. It could cruise comfortably at altitudes above 35,000 feet, a realm where Allied bombers flew in relative safety and Allied fighters struggled to maneuver. It was armed with 430 Mk-108 cannons, weapons whose high-explosive shells could tear a B-17 apart with just a handful of hits. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Me-262 was not just a new aircraft. It was a predator from the future sent back to hunt the past. But even within the German high command, there were skeptics. The most significant and most fateful was Adolf Hitler himself. When he first witnessed the Me-262 in demonstration in November 1943, he became fixated on its potential as a blitz bomber, a high-speed bomber to harry the Allied invasion forces he knew were coming. Despite the desperate pleas of General of Fighters Adolf Galland and Messerschmitt test pilot Fritz Wendel, who insisted the aircraft's true destiny was as a fighter to destroy the bomber streams, Hitler was immovable. His infamous order, "I want this as a fighter bomber," delayed the deployment of the Me-262 in its primary interceptor role for critical months. This internal German confusion provided a final, fleeting window of ignorance for the Allies. The very weapon that could have defended German skies was being hamstrung by the delusions of its own supreme commander. While Hitler dreamed of a pinprick bomber, his cities burned, and the swallows sat on the tarmac, their world-changing potential untapped. This delay, this catastrophic misallocation of a war-winning weapon, was the only reason the Allies were not confronted with the jet menace months earlier. But that grace period was now ending. The first, faint whispers of this coming storm began to reach Allied intelligence in the spring of 1944. They were fragmented, confused, and easily dismissed. A PRU Spitfire pilot, Flight Lieutenant James McCullen, returning from a high-altitude reconnaissance mission over Bavaria in April 1944, reported seeing unusually sleek, twin-engined aircraft on the apron at Lechfeld Airfield. No propellers visible. His report was filed with the notation, "Probable misidentification of Me-410 Hornets. Pilot fatigue noted." Another report from the French resistance described new silvery planes that make a strange screaming sound, not like normal engines. This was attributed to local exaggeration and rumor. The most compelling evidence came from a Czech intelligence source within the Skoda works, who reported on the machining of strange, radical turbine blades. This report, which reached the OSS in Bern, was marked low reliability and buried under a mountain of more conventional intelligence. The men who tried to sound the alarm were voices in the wilderness. One of them was a young RAF intelligence officer, Group Captain Frank Tim Wingham. A former test pilot with a keen understanding of aerodynamics, Wingham became obsessed with the scattered reports. He compiled a dossier, cross-referencing the propeller-less sightings with the reports of extreme speed and the strange engine noises. In a memo to his superiors in June 1944, he wrote, "The cumulative evidence, while circumstantial, points overwhelmingly to the existence of a German turbojet fighter in advanced operational development. Its performance, if even half of these reports are true, will render our current air superiority obsolete." He was summoned to the office of an Air Vice Marshal and politely, but firmly told to drop the matter. "Wingham," the senior officer said, pouring them both a whiskey, "the Germans are on the ropes. Their fuel situation is dire. Their production is in shambles. We are winning this war. Don't go chasing phantoms and making a nuisance of yourself. We need you focused on the real threat, the V-1 flying bombs." Wingham left the office, his dossier rejected, his warning unheeded. The machinery of Allied intelligence, so confident in its own assessments, had developed a powerful immune system against inconvenient truths. They were primed for disbelief. The first tangible, undeniable encounters began in late July 1944. They were brief, shocking affairs that left the witnesses bewildered and their commanders skeptical. On July 25, a flight of P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group, escorting B-17s to Leipzig, was jumped from above by three aircraft moving at incredible speed. Captain Urban Drew, a veteran ace with 6 kills, later reported, "They came down out of the sun like nothing I've ever seen. No props, just a trail of black smoke and a roar like a freight train. They were past us before we could even turn. I got off a futile burst, but I was aiming at where they'd been, not where they were. I've never felt so obsolete." His wingman, Lieutenant Jack Gross, simply said, "What in God's name was that?" The group's after-action report described 3 high-speed enemy aircraft of unknown type, but attributed the encounter to possible rocket-powered experimental models. The idea of a fully operational jet fighter squadron was still considered beyond German capabilities. Another encounter involved a Mosquito photo reconnaissance plane, the fastest aircraft in the RAF inventory. Piloted by flight officers Kenward and Simpson, the Mossy was on a run over Munich when Simpson, in the navigator's seat, spotted 2 fast-closing specks in his mirror. "Ken, we've got company. 2 bandits, 6 o'clock high, closing very fast." Kenward pushed the throttles to the firewall, the twin Merlin engines screaming in protest. The Mosquito could do over 400 mph. It was no use. The 2 specks grew into distinct, shark-nosed shapes with swept wings in seconds. They blew past the Mosquito on either side, so close that Simpson could see the details of their camouflage and the distinct shape of their jet intakes. They didn't fire, they just looked, then climbed away effortlessly, vanishing into the haze. "They were toying with us," a shaken Kenward reported upon landing. "It was as if we were standing still." This report from the crew of the RAF's premier fast reconnaissance aircraft finally began to shift the needle of belief. The evidence was no longer just radar blips and resistance rumors. It was visual, first-hand, and terrifying. The phrase jet fighter began to appear in intelligence summaries, no longer in skeptical quotation marks. The atmosphere in Allied command centers shifted from confident dismissal to a growing, gnawing anxiety. Something was coming, something they didn't understand. The man who would be tasked with stopping this new threat was Lieutenant General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force. The famed leader of the Tokyo raid was a pragmatist and an engineer. When the compiled reports of the jet encounters landed on his desk at High Wycombe in early August, he didn't dismiss them. He studied them. He called in his top fighter commanders, men like Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group and Hub Zemk of the 56th. "Gentlemen," Doolittle said, spreading the photos and reports on a large table, "it appears the Germans have pulled a rabbit out of their hat. These things are real. They're fast, they're high-flying, and they're going to be a hell of a problem for our bombers." The solution, they quickly realized, was deeply flawed. The P-51 Mustang, the champion of the long-range escort, was outclassed in every performance metric except turn radius and range. The only way to kill a jet, they theorized, was to catch it when it was slow and vulnerable, during takeoff, landing, or when it was lining up for a bombing run. They developed new tactics, positioning fighter sweeps near known jet airfields like Achmur and Hessep, trying to catch the 262s when they were at their most vulnerable. It was a desperate, reactive strategy. They were trying to fight a 1946 weapon with 1944 tactics. The initiative had been seized, and it was not in Allied hands. The stage was now set for the first large-scale, organized confrontation between the old world and the new. The date was September 11, 1944. The target for the 8th Air Force was a massive, coordinated raid on synthetic oil refineries in central Germany, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht. Over 1,300 B-17 and B-24 bombers were dispatched, protected by nearly 800 P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. It was a display of Allied air power at its most awesome, a sky-blackening armada intended to deliver a knockout blow to German fuel production. In the lead bomber, a B-17G named Stumpy of the 91st Bomb Group, the mood was tense but confident. They had heard the rumors, the scuttlebutt about jet jobs, but few believed it. They had flown through flak so thick you could walk on it. They had fought off swarms of FW-190s and Me-109s. What could one new plane do? As the vast formation crossed into German airspace near the Rhine, the first radio calls began to crackle with a new kind of urgency. They were not the calm, professional reports of bandit attacks they were used to. They were shouts of disbelief, of confusion, of fear. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, coming down fast. Unbelievably fast. Black sheep lead, they have no propellers, repeat, no propellers. Jesus, look at them go. They're through the formation already. B-17 going down in flames. One pass, that's all it took. High above the bomber stream, Major Walter Nowotny, one of Germany's youngest and most brilliant aces, led his Commando Nowotny, the world's first operational jet fighter unit, into the fight. His Me-262, its Jumo engines leaving twin trails of dark smoke, sliced through the thin air at 500 mph. The American formation below him looked almost stationary. He picked his target, a straggling B-17 at the edge of the group. He didn't need complex deflection shots. He simply pointed his nose, closed the distance in a heartbeat, and pressed the trigger for his 30 cannons. A short 2-second burst. The shells, traveling at relatively low velocity, arced visibly through the sky. They looked almost lazy. Then they connected. The entire left wing of the fortress disintegrated in a flash of orange flame and black smoke. The bomber cartwheeled out of the sky, pieces scattering in its wake. Nowotny didn't even break stride. He pushed the throttles forward, the G-force pressing him into his seat, and climbed away, leaving the Mustang escorts flailing in his wake, their .50 caliber bullets slicing through empty air. The American fighter pilots were experiencing a new kind of combat hell. They would spot a 262, dive to intercept, and watch in frustration as the jet simply powered away from them in a straight line. The only chance was to catch one in a turn, where its high speed became a liability, or to pounce on one as it slowed to attack the bombers. Captain Don Gentile, an ace with 21 kills, found himself in a futile tail chase with a 262. I had the throttle firewalled, the Mustang was shaking itself to pieces, and he was just walking away from me. It was the most humiliating, frightening thing I've ever seen in the air. The pilots' radios became a cacophony of frustration and alarm. They're too fast, I can't get a solution. Watch your six, they're coming back around. Where the hell did he go? The carefully orchestrated ballet of the bomber box, designed for mutual protection, was being torn apart by a weapon that operated on a different timescale. The 262s would hit and run, their attacks lasting mere seconds. They would appear, unleash devastation, and vanish before an effective defense could be mounted. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. The invincible feeling that had begun to permeate the 8th Air Force after achieving daylight air superiority evaporated in those few minutes of screaming, jet engines, and disintegrating bombers. Back at the radar station in Dover, Peter watched the situation unfold on his screen, but also through the frantic, panicked radio traffic being piped into the operations room. The ghostly blips he had tracked hours before were now wreaking havoc. He looked over at Station Commander Thwaites, who was standing pale and silent, listening to the voices of men dying in the sky over Germany. Thwaites' world of certainties, of inferior German technology and proven aerodynamics, was collapsing around him. The impossible was happening, and it was happening on his watch. In the skies over Germany, the battle reached a new peak of intensity. Nowotny's jets, low on fuel and ammunition after several devastating passes, began to disengage and head for their base at Ichmur. But the Americans had learned. A flight of P-51s from the 361st Fighter Group, led by Major Richard Peterson, had been loitering near Ichmur, waiting for this exact moment. As Nowotny's flight descended, slowing for their final approach, Peterson gave the order. Wolfpack bandits landing. Go, go, go. The Mustangs dove out of the sun. It was the scenario the Allied tacticians had hoped for. The jets at their most vulnerable, slow, with landing gear and flaps down. A frantic dogfight erupted at treetop level over the German airfield. Nowotny, low on fuel and with one engine reportedly malfunctioning, fought desperately to protect his landing comrades. The graceful predator of the high sky was now a cornered animal. Peterson latched onto the tail of a 262 and fired a long burst. Tracers converged. Pieces flew off the jet's fuselage. It trailed smoke but kept flying. Another 262, trying to take off to help, was caught by a different Mustang and blown apart on the runway. The radio traffic was a chaotic mix of triumph and terror. I got one. I got a jet. Nowotny's hit, he's going down. Brake left, there's one on your tail. On the ground at Ichmur, ground crews and other pilots watched the melee in horror. Then they saw it. Nowotny's damaged Me-262, streaming smoke, disappeared behind a line of trees. A few seconds later, a pillar of black smoke rose into the sky. The commander of the jet fighters was down, but his legacy, the shock of his weapon, was just beginning to be understood. The battle had proven the Me-262's devastating potential, but it had also shown it was not invincible. The Allies had drawn first blood, but at a terrible cost. The intelligence reassessment that followed the September 11th battle was frantic and sober. The Me-262 was no longer a rumor or a phantom. It was a concrete, lethal threat. PRU Spitfires and newly arrived, ultra-high-flying P-38 Lightnings were tasked with a new, urgent priority: find the jet production facilities. In October, they found it. Reconnaissance photos of a vast, heavily camouflaged complex near Kala in Thuringia revealed something that made analysts in Medmenham gasp. It wasn't a factory above ground. It was a system of tunnels burrowed into a mountain, code-named Latch, Salmon. The entrance was hidden. The dispersal areas were cunningly concealed, and parked outside in revetments carved into the forest were Me-262s. Dozens of them. The scale was staggering. This was not a boutique workshop for a few exotic prototypes. This was a mass production facility for a war-winning weapon, operating right under their noses. Further analysis of other photos revealed more hidden factories, dispersed across southern Germany and Austria, all linked by a network of autobahns that served as makeshift runways. The production estimates, once revised, were horrifying. Intelligence now believed the Germans could produce between 1,200 and 1,500 Me-262s by the end of 1945. The Allied response was immediate and overwhelming. The oil campaign remained the top priority, but now, jet aircraft production centers became a primary target for both the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command. The race was on. Could the Allies bomb the jets out of existence before the jets bombed the Allies out of the sky? As the autumn of 1944 turned to the brutal winter of 1945, a deadly cat-and-mouse game developed over the Reich. The jets, operating from their hidden bases, continued to take a fearsome toll on the bomber streams. But the Allies adapted. They deployed entire fighter groups to fly jet hunter patrols. They developed new formations, with specific flights of Mustangs assigned to watch the high altitudes, ready to dive on the 262s. They learned to exploit the jet's weaknesses: its poor acceleration at low speeds, its vulnerability during takeoff and landing, its high fuel consumption which limited its time in the combat zone. American aces began to add jet kills to their scores, but it was always a difficult, dangerous achievement. The P-51 pilots joked darkly that killing a 262 required the German pilot to make a mistake. The technological gap was still vast. The pressure on the German jet program was immense. While the aircraft itself was a marvel, the infrastructure supporting it was crumbling. The bombing campaign, though it couldn't destroy the hidden factories completely, was strangling the supply chain. Fuel was critically short. Trained pilots were even shorter. The jets were being flown by a mix of veteran aces, transferred from piston engine units, and young, hastily trained pilots who struggled to master the temperamental machine. The average life expectancy of a new Mi-262 pilot was measured in weeks. Yet, the attacks continued, growing in sophistication. The Germans began arming the 262 with R-4 million air-to-air rockets, devastating volleys of 24 rockets that could obliterate a bomber formation in a single pass, without the jet ever having to enter the range of the bomber's defensive 50 caliber guns. Each new innovation was a fresh shock to the Allied airmen. By early March 1945, the war on the ground was rushing toward its conclusion. Allied armies were across the Rhine. The end was in sight. But in the air, the jet war was reaching its terrifying crescendo. The Luftwaffe, in a final, desperate throw of the dice, had managed to concentrate a significant force of Mi-262s. The goal was no longer to win the war, but to deliver such a bloody nose to the Allied air forces that it would shock the Western Allies into a more favorable negotiated peace, or at least buy time for the mythical Alpine redoubt. The stage for this final, apocalyptic air battle was set for March 18, 1945. The target was Berlin itself. On that cold, clear morning, the largest bomber formation of the entire war took off from bases across England. Its mission: to pulverize what remained of the German capital. Over 1,300 heavy bombers protected by more than 900 fighters formed up over the North Sea. The mood was different this time. There was no casual confidence. Every pilot, from the greenest co-pilot in a Liberator to the battle-hardened aces in the Mustangs, knew what was waiting for them. They had been briefed extensively on the Mi-262. They had studied its silhouette. They had practiced the new, desperate tactics. They knew the jets would come. The only questions were, how many and could they stop them? As the vast armada crossed the German coast, the first radar warnings came in. Not just the usual scattered contacts. This was different. The operators in England and in the airborne radar as the vast armada crossed the German coast, the first radar warnings came in. Not just the usual scattered contacts. This was different. The operators in England and in the airborne radar pickets saw them materialize on their screens like a swarm of angry hornets erupting from a disturbed nest. Dozens of contacts, climbing from airfields all across northwestern Germany, converging with terrifying speed on the bomber stream. The radio, which had been filled with the usual pre-mission chatter, fell into a tense, static-laced silence, broken only by the clipped, professional voice of the mission controller. All units be advised. Multiple bandit contacts converging on the stream. Angels 30+, high closure rate. This is not a drill, good hunting. In the lead bomber of the 1st Combat Wing, the B-17G Stumpy was on its 30th mission. Its pilot, Captain Bill "Stumpy" Matthews, a lanky Kansan who had earned his nickname after losing 2 fingers to flak over Schweinfurt, gripped the control yoke a little tighter. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Andy Ricken, a fresh-faced replacement on his 5th mission, looked over, his eyes wide. "You think it's them, Stumpy? The jets?" Stumpy kept his eyes fixed on the endless sea of bombers stretching to the horizon. "Only one thing moves that fast, Rick. Just remember the briefing. They hit fast, they hit hard, but they can't stay. Keep your eyes peeled and call 'em out early." He keyed the intercom to the crew. "All right, boys, listen up. The word is we've got jet traffic inbound. Gunners, stay sharp. They'll be on us and gone before you can blink. Don't track 'em, lead 'em. Bombardier, once we're on the run, you own the ship. No matter what happens, we get the bombs on target. This is for Berlin. High above, in the crystalline air at 35,000 feet, Major Richard Peterson, who had downed Nowotny months before, led his squadron of P-51Ds. They were the top cover, tasked with the near-impossible job of intercepting the 262s before they could dive on the bombers. His eyes, squinted against the glare, scanned the empty blue dome above. His wingman, Lieutenant Charlie Chuck Wellen, crackled over the radio. "Lead, I've got nothing, not a contrail, not a glint. You think Intel got it wrong?" "Negative, Chuck," Peterson replied, his voice calm but tight. "They're up here. I can feel it, they're just waiting." He knew the jets held all the cards. They could choose the time, the place, the angle of attack. The Mustangs could only react. It was a defensive fight, and he hated defensive fights. Then he saw them. Not as distinct aircraft at first, but as a collection of faint, dark scratches against the deep blue, high above even his own lofty perch. They were so high they were barely visible. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, Angels 40. Jesus, they're high. He shoved the throttle forward, the Merlin engine roaring as he began a shallow climb, knowing it was futile. The specks grew, resolving into the unmistakable, sinister shark-like profiles of the Me-262s. There were not dozens. There were over 50. It was the largest concentration of jet fighters ever assembled. The lead jet, marked with the distinctive tulip leaf pattern of Jagdverband 44. The elite squadron of experts, formed by General Adolf Galland, was piloted by Oberleutnant Erich Büttner, a 23-year-old ace with 42 kills to his name, half of them scored in the 262. He looked down at the American formation. It was a sight that would have frozen the blood of any previous generation of pilots, a seemingly invincible river of aluminum, bristling with guns, stretching for miles. To Büttner it looked like a target range. He switched his radio to the unit frequency. Alle Adler, Heirer ist Adler 1, Ziel ist in Sicht, Bomberpolk im Ersten Kampfverband, wir teilen uns auf wie besprochen. Gruppe 1 mit mir auf die Führungsflugzeug, Gruppe 2 auf die Außenseiter, Gruppe 3 Deckung gegen die Jäger, viel Glück, Kameraden, für das Vaterland. He pushed the twin throttles forward, the Jumo engines responding with a deep-throated roar, and tipped the nose over into a near-vertical dive. The battle did not begin, it erupted. The sky, a moment before a scene of serene, ordered power, disintegrated into a maelstrom of screaming metal, tracers, and flames. The 262s fell upon the bomber stream like falcons striking a flock of pigeons. Their speed was not merely fast. It was disorienting, a violation of the known laws of aerial combat. In Stumpy, the top turret gunner, Sergeant Joe "Pop" O'Reilly, a 40-year-old veteran of the First War, was the first to see them. Bandits, coming down at 2 o'clock, their jets. "Lead 'em, boys, for Christ's sake, lead 'em." He swung his twin .50s, firing a long, hopeful burst at a blur that shot past his field of fire before his tracers had even reached its previous position. It was like trying to shoot a rifle bullet with a slingshot. A 262, its camouflage a blur, flashed through the formation ahead of Stumpy's wing. There was a brief, stuttering flash from its nose, the distinctive pow-pow-pow sound of the 30 cannons audible even over the roar of 1,000 engines. A B-24 Liberator, the Dragon's Wrath, simply came apart. Its fuselage snapped in two, the wings folding upward like a child's toy crushed under a boot. There were no parachutes. "God Almighty," Rickon whispered, his knuckles white on the yoke. "Eyes on your sector, Rick," Stumpy barked, fighting to keep the fortress steady as the concussion from the exploding Liberator buffeted them. He saw another 262, this one lining up on his own group from the rear. Ball turret, Bandit 6 o'clock low, coming up fast. In the cramped, claustrophobic ball turret dangling beneath the bomber, Corporal Sammy Greenberg, a 19-year-old from Brooklyn, heard the call. He rotated the turret, his world a spinning panorama of sky, earth, and death. He saw the jet, a gray arrowhead growing with impossible speed. He squeezed the triggers, his 250 calibers chattering, the tracers lancing out. He saw his rounds passing behind the jet. He let it more, his muscles straining against the hydraulic controls. He was leading it by what felt like a mile, firing into empty space, praying his math was right. For a breathtaking second, it seemed to work. The 262 flew directly into his cone of fire. He saw sparks erupt along its fuselage and wing root. A cheer died in his throat as the jet, seemingly unfazed, continued its climb, a thin stream of brown coolant or fuel trailing behind it. It had been hit, but it wasn't down, and it had not fired a shot. It had been fixated on another target. High above, Peterson and his Mustangs were in a desperate fight for their own lives. The third group of 262s, the top cover, was engaging them, not to dogfight, but to keep them occupied while the others slaughtered the bombers. A 262 flown by a pilot of breathtaking skill made a high-speed pass on Peterson's flight. It didn't try to turn with them. It came in from the side in a shallow curve, its cannons blazing. Peterson's element leader, Lieutenant Mike Moose Ferrara, flying Detroit Miss, took a direct hit in the engine. The big Merlin coughed once, belched a cloud of white smoke and dark oil and seized solid. "Moose, you're hit," Peterson yelled. "I'm out lead. Engine's dead. Gotta put her down." Moose's voice was eerily calm. He pushed the stricken Mustang into a dive, aiming for the relative safety of the cloud layer thousands of feet below, a swarm of German flak batteries waiting for him. Peterson felt a cold fury. He saw the 262 that had made the kill, already miles away, climbing back to altitude for another pass. He was powerless to catch it. He could only watch as the jets systematically dismantled the formation. He switched his radio to the command frequency. "Big friend, this is little friend lead. They're tearing us apart up here. We cannot maintain contact. Suggest you abort. Repeat, abort the mission." The reply from the mission commander, flying in a fortress at the heart of the storm, was grim but resolute. "Negative, little friend lead. The target is Berlin. We are proceeding." On the ground, in a makeshift command bunker near the ruins of Potsdam, General Galland listened to the radio reports from his pilots. A rare, grim smile touched his lips. It was working. The gamble, the concentration of every serviceable jet, was paying off. The sky over Berlin was becoming a graveyard for American bombers. For the first time in months, the Luftwaffe was fighting back on its own terms. He could hear the distant, thunderous crump of bombs hitting the city, but he could also hear the satisfying staccato reports of his pilots. "Abschuss, Abschuss," another kill, and another. The 262s, armed with the R-4 million rockets, were particularly devastating. A single jet could loose a volley into a tight bomber box and claim 2 or 3 kills in a single, fleeting pass. But Galland's smile was short-lived. The reports of losses began to trickle in. The American fighters, though outclassed, were tenacious. They had learned. They were waiting near the airfields. Oberleutnant Schreiber beim Landingflug von Jegern Abgeskassen, shot down on final approach. Lieutenant Hauser, Triebwerkosfall nach Treffer, engine failure after being hit. The jets were winning the battle, but they were bleeding, and each pilot lost was irreplaceable. Back in the bomber stream, the battle reached a new peak of ferocity. Stumpy's group was now on the bomb run, the aircraft locked on the autopilot as the bombardier took control. They were flying straight and level, a sitting duck. The flak began to blossom around them, black, oily smudges that rattled the airframe, and through the flak the jets came again. This time one had them in its sights. Büttner himself, having dispatched 2 bombers already, had spotted the lead aircraft of the combat wing. Destroy the leader, disrupt the bombing. It was a classic tactic, executed with futuristic speed. He approached from the rear, high and slightly to the side, his airspeed touching 500 mph. "Bandit, 9 o'clock level, he's lining up on us." This from the waist gunner. Stumpy could do nothing. He was a pilot on a train track, hurtling toward the destination. He could only watch. Bombardier, how long? 30 seconds, skipper. Hold her steady. The world narrowed to the vibrating airframe, the pounding of his own heart, and the growing shape of the shark-nosed jet in his peripheral vision. He saw the flicker of light from its wings as it fired its rockets. A cloud of R4MAs, looking like a swarm of angry bees, streaked toward them. Evasive action, Rickon screamed, his hand instinctively reaching for the yoke. No, Stumpy roared, slapping his hand away. We hold the line. We hold the goddamn line. It was a moment of supreme, terrible courage. To stay straight and level while death raced toward them was an act of faith and discipline that defied every survival instinct. The rockets screamed past, so close they could feel the wind of their passage. One grazed the tail, tearing a chunk off the horizontal stabilizer. The aircraft shuddered violently but held course. Bootner, expecting the bomber to break, had misjudged his lead. His cannons fired a split second late, the 30 shells passing just feet behind the tail gunner's position. He missed. The son of a bitch missed, the tail gunner yelled, his voice cracking with relief and adrenaline. But Bootner wasn't finished. He pulled up into a steep, climbing turn, his speed bleeding off rapidly. It was a mistake born of frustration. He had presented a target. In his P-51, Peterson saw it. The 262 was slow, climbing, its black-crossed wings a perfect profile against the smoke-stained sky. He was lower, but he had the energy advantage. He nosed over into a dive, building up speed, the airframe screaming in protest. "Chuck with me, that one's mine." He closed the distance with terrifying speed. The 262 filled his gun sight. He could see the details now, the mottled gray paint, the tulip pattern on the nose, the faint stream of smoke from the left engine. He ignored the closing speed, ignored everything but the pipper centered on the jet's fuselage. At 400 yards, he opened fire. All 650 caliber machine guns erupted, a solid stream of lead and tracers converging on the Me-262. The effect was instantaneous. Pieces of the turbine blades shredded the left engine, which belched a torrent of flame. The canopy, peppered with holes, flew off. He saw the pilot, Bootner, slump forward for a moment, then struggle with the controls. The jet rolled onto its back and began a final, fatal descent toward the ravaged city below. Peterson didn't watch it crash. He was already pulling back on the stick, his body crushed into the seat by G-forces, scanning for the next threat. There was no triumph, only a grim, weary satisfaction. He had killed a man, a brilliant pilot in a magnificent machine, but he had saved a bomber, maybe two. In this new, brutal calculus, that was a victory. The bomb run ended. "Bombs away," the bombardier called, and the B-17 leapt upward, relieved of its burden. Stumpy immediately slammed the yoke forward and to the right, throwing the damaged bomber into a diving turn away from the target area. The hellish flak and the screaming jets were behind them now, but the journey home was just beginning. The Battle of March 18th was a tactical defeat for the Allies. They lost over 40 bombers and a dozen fighters. It was one of the costliest days of the air war. But it was a strategic dead end for the Germans. They had shot down a formidable number of aircraft, but they had lost nearly a third of their committed jet force, including some of their best and most experienced pilots. The concentrated blow they had hoped would break the Allied will had only hardened it. The bombers had still plastered Berlin. The production of jets, already crippled by the bombing of the fuel infrastructure, could not replace such losses. In the weeks that followed, the jet threat, while never vanishing, began to diminish. The hidden factories were bombed relentlessly. The fuel dries ran dry. Skilled pilots became a commodity more precious than the aircraft themselves. The Me-262s, when they flew, were often hunted down by overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters who had perfected the art of the ambush. The technological marvel, born too late and starved of the resources it needed to thrive, was slowly being strangled. The final act of the drama did not take place in the air, but on the ground. In late April, as American tanks overran Bavaria, A team from the U.S. Army Air Force's Technical Intelligence, led by a young, brilliant engineer named Colonel Harold Watson, was given an urgent mission: find the secrets of the German jet program. Acting on tips from captured engineers and translated documents, they raced against the advancing Russians, heading for the very heart of the mystery, the hidden complex at Kala. What they found there in the cool, dimly lit tunnels of the Latch facility took their breath away. It was a futuristic cathedral carved into a mountain. Partially assembled Me-262s sat on production jigs, their swept wings and sleek fuselages looking utterly alien amidst the rough-hewn rock walls. Tools were still laid out as if the workers had just stepped away for lunch. Blueprints and technical manuals were stacked neatly on desks. It was a complete, functioning factory, frozen in time. Watson, running his hand over the smooth skin of a jet fuselage, felt a shiver that was part awe, part fear. "My God," he whispered to his sergeant. "They were years ahead of us. If they'd had another 6 months, just another 6 months." His team fanned out, gathering everything they could: design specs, engine parts, turbine blades. They found the records of production, the numbers that Allied intelligence had so grossly underestimated. They interrogated the few German engineers who had stayed behind, men like Dr. Anselm France's deputies, who spoke of the triumphs and the frustrations, of the revolutionary potential hamstrung by Hitler's interference and the collapsing war economy. The story they pieced together was one of breathtaking genius squandered by strategic folly. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The silence that fell over the continent was profound, broken only by the sounds of celebration and mourning. In the operations room at the Chain Home Station in Dover, the radar screens were dark. The war was over. Peter, the young operator who had first tracked the ghostly blips, was packing his personal effects into a small cardboard box. He was being demobilized, sent back to a civilian life he could barely remember. Station Commander Reginald Thwaites stood by the window, looking out over the English Channel, now peaceful and empty. He turned to Peter, his face lined with a new humility. "You were right, you know," Thwaites said, his voice quiet. "That day, about the contacts, you were right and I was a fool." Peter stopped packing and looked up. "It wasn't about being right, sir. It was about what it meant." Thwaites nodded slowly. "It meant the world had changed, and we were still fighting the last war." He paused. "What will you do now?" Peter shrugged. "Go back to university, I suppose. Study engineering, maybe. Someone has to build the next thing, don't they? Can't let ourselves be surprised again." Thwaites managed a faint smile. "No, I suppose we can't." He watched the young man leave, the box under his arm, and turned back to the window. The arrogance of that autumn day in 1944 felt like a lifetime ago. He had learned a brutal lesson about the price of underestimating an enemy, about the relentless march of technology. The Swallows had been beaten, but they had heralded a new, terrifying age of warfare, an age where the sky would no longer be a sanctuary, and the only constant would be the shock of the new. In the skies over occupied Germany, the final, ironic chapter was being written. American pilots, the very men who had fought and died trying to destroy the Me-262, were now flying them. Under Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe's secret Technologue Y, captured jets were being test-flown, their performance meticulously documented. Pilots like Major Richard Peterson found themselves sitting in the cockpit of the machine he had so desperately tried to kill. The cockpit was cramped, the instruments labeled in German, the feel of it utterly foreign. He was given a careful checkout by a captured German test pilot, a man who spoke broken English but shared the universal language of flying. The man showed him the throttles, the delicate touch needed, the critical speeds for takeoff and landing. Then it was Peterson's turn. The Jumo engine spooled up with a high-pitched whine, unlike the deep-throated roar of his Mustang. He released the brakes. The acceleration was smooth, relentless, pressing him back into his seat. The runway blurred. He pulled back on the stick, and the 262 leapt into the air with an eagerness that was startling. He retracted the gear, climbed out, and pushed the throttles forward. The world outside the canopy dissolved. The sense of speed was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was quiet, eerily so, just the rush of wind and the whine of the turbines. He looked down and saw the landscape streaming past, a map unfolding in real time. He tried a gentle turn, feeling the aircraft respond with a solid, powerful grace. He understood in that moment everything. He understood the fear in the eyes of his bomber crews, the frustration of his fellow fighter pilots, the sheer, awesome leap this machine represented. He had spent the last months of the war fighting a phantom from the future, and now he was riding inside it. He brought the jet in for a landing, the approach fast, the touchdown smooth. As he taxied to a stop and shut down the engines, a profound silence descended. He sat there for a long time, the scent of kerosene and hot metal filling the cockpit. The war was over. The swallows were grounded. But the world they had heralded was just beginning. The lesson of the jet was not just a story of a single weapon. It was a permanent warning. The next surprise was always being designed, in some hidden laboratory, in the mind of some brilliant, driven engineer, and the cost of disbelief would always be paid in blood. The battle was over, but the race had just begun.